The storm stopped for 1 hour. That was the first mercy Frostbend Ranch had seen in 3 days. Snow leaned against the fences in white walls. The pine trees beyond the yard stood stiff and black. Their branches bent under ice. Wind dragged itself over the roof like claws. Then fell away into a silence that made the whole house feel buried. Caleb Varron stood outside the nursery door and listened. His son was not crying. That was wrong. Noah had come into the world angry. 7 months old. Red-faced. Loud. And stubborn from the first breath. Lydia used to laugh when he screamed through the night. "He has your temper," she would say. Half tired. Half proud. But Lydia was gone now. And Noah had gone quiet. Caleb pressed one hand against the nursery door. Heat pushed through the wood. Too much heat. The rest of the house was cold enough to make breath show in the halls. But this room had been kept shut and burning for days because Mr. Alden Rusk said fever must be fought with warmth. Stillness. And sleep. Rusk stepped out a moment later, closing the door behind him with careful fingers. He was a narrow man in a clean dark coat, with silver spectacles and soft hands. People in 3 towns trusted him because he spoke like a book and never looked uncertain. "Mr. Varron," Rusk said. "The child is resting." Caleb stared at him. Resting children move. The fever has taken much from him. He was crying this morning. Yes. And crying wastes strength. Rusk adjusted his spectacles. The tincture has helped him settle. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You gave him more." "A necessary amount." Before Caleb could answer, Silas Crow came down the hall. Silas had run Frostbend for 6 years. He knew the cattle, the men, the accounts, the roads, the storms, since Lydia vanished. He had been everywhere Caleb could not be. "Caleb," Silas said gently, "you need sleep. Let Rusk do his work. My son looks worse every time he does." Rusk's face hardened. Silas lowered his voice. "Grief makes every shadow look guilty." Caleb looked from one man to the other. Then he opened the nursery door. Heat struck him like an oven door swinging wide. The curtains were shut. The fire was too high. Blankets covered the cradle in thick layers. Mrs. Hattie Bell sat near the hearth, with her hands folded tight in her lap. Her face pale with worry. She was trying to hide. Caleb crossed the room and pulled one blanket back. Noah lay beneath it, flushed and damp, breathing in small, shallow pulls. His tiny hands did not reach. His eyelids barely moved. Caleb felt the floor tilt under him. "Why is he wrapped this tight?" Mrs. Bell looked toward Rusk. "I followed orders." "Terror. He can hardly breathe. He needs warmth," Rusk said from the doorway. "He needs air." Then, the front door slammed somewhere below. Fast footsteps crossed the hall. Not a servant's steps. Not a ranch hand's. Someone had entered without permission. A woman appeared in the nursery doorway with snow melting from her boots and a man's coat hanging loose from her shoulders. Her dark hair was tangled beneath a wool scarf. Gray streaked through it. Her face was thin, weathered, and hard from roads that had not been kind. Her eyes went straight to the cradle. "You're killing that baby," she said. Caleb stepped in front of Noah. "Who are you?" "Eliza Thorn." "That name means nothing to me." "It meant something to your wife." The room froze. Eliza reached into her coat and tossed something small across the space. Caleb caught it by instinct. A gold ring. Lydia's ring. Inside the band were the words he had once had engraved in secret. "To L. With all IMC." Caleb's breath left him. Eliza did not wait for permission. She moved past him, stripped the heavy blankets away from Noah, and pulled the curtains open. Cold gray light entered the nursery. Rusk rushed forward. "This woman has no authority here." Eliza looked at him once. "Neither does a fool with clean hands." She lifted Noah carefully, loosened the cloth around him, and turned him toward the cooler air. Mrs. Bell stood, trembling. Silas did not move. Caleb wanted to stop Eliza. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted Lydia to walk through the door and tell him what to do. Then Noah gasped. Once. Then again. A thin, broken cry, rose from his small chest. It grew louder, sharper, alive. The sound tore through the nursery like a church bell in a burning town. Mrs. Bell covered her mouth. Rusk went white. Silas Crow's calm face cracked for half a second. Caleb stood with Lydia's ring burning in his palm, listening to his son scream himself back into the world. And for the first time in days, he prayed the crying would not stop. Noah's cry filled the nursery until the walls seemed to shake with it. Caleb had never thought a baby's scream could sound like mercy. For 3 days, every small noise had faded. Every breath had grown thinner. Every hour had felt like a shovel digging closer to the thing he feared most. Now his son was angry, alive, fighting. Eliza Thorn held Noah upright against her shoulder, one steady hand supporting his back. She did not smile. She did not look proud. She only listened to the cry as if it were proof in a court of law. Mrs. Hattie Bell stood beside the hearth with tears shining in her eyes. "He is crying," she whispered. "Yes," Eliza said. "That is what living babies do when the world offends them." Mr. Alden Rusk stepped forward, his face tight with fury. "You had no right to interfere." Eliza turned her head slowly. "And you had no right to silence him. That child was under my care. That child was disappearing under your care." Rusk's cheeks colored. "Mr. Varron, remove this woman at once." Caleb did not move. His fingers had closed around Lydia's ring so tightly that the edge pressed into his skin. The gold was real. The engraving was real. The memory of placing it on Lydia's finger was real. Silas Crow took one careful step into the nursery. "Caleb," he said, calm as ever, "think before you act. A ring proves only that she has a ring." Elisa's eyes cut to him. Silas did not flinch. "Mrs. Varron disappeared in a storm. We do not know who found her, or what was taken from her." The words struck Caleb hard. "Taken from her." He looked at Eliza. "Where did you get this?" "From Lydia. My wife is dead." "Yes." The room went silent except for Noah's crying. Caleb felt the cold from the open window against the back of his neck. "You saw her die." Eliza's face changed then. Not softened. Not exactly. But something tired moved through it. "She found me north of the mining camps," Eliza said. She had ridden through weather that should have turned her back. She was half frozen, half starved, and still more stubborn than any living soul I have met. Caleb closed his eyes for 1 second. "That sounded like Lydia. She said Noah was in danger." Eliza continued. "She said the danger wore clean clothes and used polite words. She said the people closest to you could not be trusted." Silas's voice lowered. "This is poison." Eliza looked at Caleb. "Not Silas. She told me if I reached this house too late, your son would be buried beside her." Rusk made a sharp sound. "Madness. Is it?" Eliza asked. "Then answer one question. Why did the child grow quieter every time you called him improved?" Rusk opened his mouth, then shut it. Mrs. Bell looked down. Caleb saw it. That was the first crack. "Hattie," he said. The nurse flinched at the use of her first name. "Tell me true. Did Noah seem better to you?" Her hands twisted in her apron. "I am not learned like Mr. Rusk. I did not ask what you learned. I asked what you saw." Mrs. Bell swallowed. "I saw a baby fading." Rusk turned on her. "You forget your place." "No," Eliza said. "I think she just remembered it." Silas stepped closer to Caleb. "This is grief speaking. Yours. Hers. Maybe even Mrs. Bell's. We are all shaken. Let us take a breath before accusations destroy this house." Caleb looked at him. For 6 years, Silas had been the sensible voice, the practical hand, the man who always knew what needed doing when Caleb was too tired to think. But Lydia had trusted no one in the end. Only a stranger. Caleb looked at the ring again. What else did she say? Eliza shifted Noah gently, lowering him into Mrs. Bell's arms. "Feed him when he settles. Small and steady. Do not leave him alone with either of these men." Rusk stiffened. "How dare you?" Caleb's voice cut through the room. "Enough." Everyone stopped. Even Noah's cry weakened into broken little sounds. Caleb pointed to Mrs. Bell. "Stay with my son." "Yes, sir." He looked at Rusk. "You do not touch him again unless I say so." Rusk went pale. "Mr. Varron. This is irrational." "No. Irrational was standing outside that door while my son disappeared, because every man in this house told me not to trust my own eyes." Silas's expression tightened. But only for a heartbeat. Caleb saw that too. He turned to Eliza. "You will come with me." "Where?" "My study." Silas moved at once. "Caleb. I should be present." "No." The word landed hard. Silas stared at him. "You do not want to be alone with a woman who may be lying." Caleb stepped closer. Lydia's ring still in his fist. "And you do not want me to hear what she has to say." For the first time since Eliza entered the house. Silas Crow had no answer. Caleb opened the nursery door. Eliza walked past him into the hall, leaving wet boot prints on the polished floor. Behind them, Noah began crying again. Not strong yet. Not safe yet. But loud enough to follow Caleb all the way to his study. And every step sounded like Lydia calling him back from the lie he had been living inside. Caleb shut the study door hard enough to shake dust from the frame. Eliza did not flinch. She stood near the cold fireplace, snow melting from the hem of her coat. Her eyes moving across the room. Ledger books. Maps. A locked cabinet. A portrait of Lydia on the wall. Painted before Noah was born. When her eyes still held that bright, stubborn light, Caleb had loved and argued with an equal measure. Eliza looked at the portrait for a long second. She was braver than she looked. She said. Caleb's throat tightened. "She was braver than I deserved." Eliza turned back to him. "Then start deserving her now." The words struck clean. Caleb opened his hand. Lydia's ring lay in his palm, warm from his grip. "Tell me everything." "She found records," Eliza said. "Not full proof. Not yet. Patterns. Families that lost infants. Men who gained property after grief made the mothers too weak to fight and the fathers too ashamed to ask questions. Silas. His name appeared near too many doors. Caleb shook his head. "He has been with me 6 years. And that is why he got close enough." Before Caleb could answer, someone knocked. 3 careful taps. Silas would not knock like that. Caleb opened the door. Mr. Alden Rusk stood in the hallway, pale and stiff, his medical bag clutched in one hand. "I need to speak with you," Rusk said. Eliza's expression did not change. "Good. Cowards are useful when they finally get frightened." Rusk looked at her with open dislike. "You do not know what you are speaking of. I know your hands shook when the baby cried." Caleb stepped aside. "Come in." Rusk entered. But he did not sit. His eyes went first to Caleb, then to Eliza, then to the door, as if measuring how fast he could reach it. Caleb spoke quietly. "Who told you to increase Noah's doses?" "No one." Eliza crossed her arms. "Try again." Rusk swallowed. "I made choices based on the child's condition." "No," Caleb said. "You made choices that made my son worse." Rusk's face tightened. "I never meant for harm to come to him." The room went still. Caleb felt the meaning of those words settle like ice. "You never meant," he repeated. Rusk closed his eyes. When he opened them, his pride was gone. What remained was smaller, uglier, fearful. "Silas Crow came to me months ago," Rusk said. "He knew things about me. Debts. Mistakes. Things that would ruin what reputation I have left." Eliza's voice was flat. "So, you let him own you?" "I thought I was helping manage a fever. I thought the measures were harsh but reasonable." He said Mr. Varron was blinded by grief. He said the ranch needed stability. My son needed a father. Caleb said. Rusk looked away. Caleb stepped toward him. "Did Lydia know?" "She suspected. She asked questions. Too many questions." Rusk's voice dropped. "She came to me once. Asked about other families. Other children. I told Silas." The words hit Caleb harder than a fist. "You told him?" "I was afraid." Eliza moved before Caleb did. She did not strike Rusk. She only stepped between them. Close enough to stop what grief might make Caleb do. "Where are the papers?" she asked. "What papers?" "The ones Silas made you follow." Rusk's mouth trembled. "He took them." "Of course he did." Caleb's voice came rough. "Then we need Lydia's." He turned toward the door. Eliza followed at once. Rusk remained behind, breathing like a man who had just climbed out of his own grave. They went upstairs to the bedroom. Caleb had not entered since Lydia vanished. The bed was made. Her shawl still lay over the chair. A book sat open on the small table, face down, as if she had meant to return before the page forgot her. Caleb stopped. For one terrible moment. He could not move. Eliza's voice softened. But only slightly. "Where did she write?" Caleb pointed to a narrow door beside the wardrobe. "There." It was locked. "She carried the key," he said. Then she expected no one else to enter. Caleb stared at the door. Then he drove his shoulder into it. The old lock broke with a sharp crack. Inside was Lydia's writing room. Small. Neat. Cold. A desk stood beneath the window. Papers were stacked in perfect lines. Dried lavender hung from a nail. On the wall, Lydia had pinned a map of the territory with small black marks across 3 counties. Eliza went to the map. Caleb opened the desk. At first, there were only letters, receipts, household notes. Then his hand found a loose board behind the lowest drawer. He pulled it free. Inside lay a leather folder, tied with blue thread. Lydia's thread. Caleb opened it. Names, dates, families, children who had died before their first birthday. And beside 5 of the names, written in Lydia's careful hand. The same note appeared again and again. Silas Crow present. Caleb sat down slowly. Eliza picked up one letter and read in silence. Her face hardened with every line. She found him. Eliza said, "Your wife found the pattern." Caleb looked at the folder. Then at Lydia's empty chair. For weeks, he had thought she had left him with questions. Now he understood. She had left him a map. And every mark on it pointed toward the man still walking free inside his house. Caleb did not sleep that night. He sat in Lydia's writing room until dawn, reading every page she had hidden from him. Names, dates, towns, children buried under words like fever, weakness, natural loss, and again, somewhere near each tragedy, there was Silas Crow. Not always in the center. That was the clever part. Sometimes, he was a foreman. Sometimes an advisor. Sometimes, a temporary manager after grief had emptied a house of clear thinking. He arrived useful, stayed, trusted, and left richer. Eliza stood by the window with Noah in her arms. The baby had slept for short stretches, then woken angry and hungry. Every cry still made Caleb's heart leap. But Eliza called it good. "Silence is what scared me," she said. "Noise means he is still fighting." Caleb folded one of Lydia's letters with careful hands. "We take this to Millstone. If Silas lets us, he will not know." Eliza looked at him. Men like that always know when control starts slipping. Downstairs, Frostbend Ranch began to wake. Boots crossed the kitchen. A door opened and shut. Someone carried firewood through the back hall. The house sounded normal. And that made everything worse. Caleb found Silas in the main barn before breakfast. His foreman stood near the harness wall, speaking with 2 ranch hands. He turned when Caleb entered. His face calm, concerned, almost kind. "Caleb," Silas said. "How is the boy?" "Better." "I am glad." The lie sounded perfect. Caleb forced himself to look tired instead of furious. "There is trouble at the North Winter pasture." Silas frowned. "What trouble?" "Fence down. Maybe cattle scattered. I got word before dawn." "From who?" "Jonas Reed." Silas's eyes narrowed only slightly. "Jonas did not mention it to me. I am mentioning it now." The barn went quiet. Caleb stepped closer. "I cannot leave Noah. I need someone I trust to see it handled." For one breath, Silas studied him. Then the old mask returned. Of course, he said. I will ride within the hour. Take Cal Rennet and Jonas with you. Silas smiled faintly. You are giving me your best men. I need the job done right. The words tasted like ash. Silas placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. You are making the right choice. Grief can cloud a man, but work steadies him. Caleb held still until Silas walked away. Only then did he let himself breathe. An hour later, Silas rode north with Jonas and Cal through a curtain of pale snow. Caleb watched from the upper window until the riders vanished between the pines. Eliza came up behind him. Did he believe you? He wanted to. That is not the same thing. No. They packed fast. Lydia's folder went into a waterproof satchel. Noah was wrapped for travel. Not smothered. His small face, visible beneath the wool. Mrs. Hattie Bell stood in the nursery doorway. Pale but steady. You are taking him out in this weather? She asked. I am taking him away from this house, Caleb said. Hattie looked toward the hall. Then go before Mr. Crow changes his mind and comes back. Eliza paused beside her. You knew something was wrong. Hattie's eyes filled. I knew enough to be ashamed. Shame later. Watch now. The nurse nodded. Caleb. Eliza. And Noah left Frostbend through the back trail before noon. The road south was half buried. Snow erased tracks almost as soon as the horses made them. Caleb rode ahead. One hand inside his coat, gripping Lydia's ring. Eliza followed with Noah held close against her chest. They reached Broken Lantern Station near dusk. The old shelter stood crooked under the weight of snow. Caleb had just led the horses beneath the broken roof when 3 riders appeared through the gray. He reached for the nearest lantern hook, ready to swing it if needed. Mr. Varron, a voice called. Jonas Reed rode in first, his horse lathered and stumbling. Cal Rennet followed behind him, grim-faced. Caleb stepped forward. Where is Silas? Jonas slid from the saddle. On his way back to Frostbend. He knew the pasture story was false before we reached the ridge. Eliza's face hardened. How? Because he had already sent a man to Millstone yesterday. Jonas looked at Caleb. He told the sheriff, you might come south with wild claims. Said grief had broken your judgment. Said this woman had filled your head with lies. Caleb felt the world narrow. He reached the sheriff first. Jonas nodded. There is more, Cal said quietly. Noah stirred against Eliza's coat. Caleb turned. Say it. Rusk is dead, Jonas said. They found a written confession beside him. It takes blame for Noah's treatment and says Silas tried to stop him. For a moment, even the storm seemed to go silent. Eliza closed her eyes once. Silas cut away the weak piece. Caleb looked toward the south, where Millstone waited with a sheriff already warned against him. Then back north, where Frostbend belonged to a liar. We cannot go to Millstone, he said. No, Eliza answered. And we cannot go home. No. Jonas reached into his coat. Mrs. Varron mentioned someone in her letters. Ruth called her. Cinder, Ravine Crossing. Her boy was one of the names. Eliza opened her eyes. Caleb understood. Not the sheriff. Not the ranch. The mothers. The ones Lydia had written to. He tightened his grip on the satchel. Then we ride east. Behind them, Frostbend vanished beneath snow and lies. Ahead, somewhere beyond the frozen ravine, waited the first person who might believe the dead. They rode east until the world lost its edges. Snow swallowed the trail. Pines rose and vanished like dark ghosts. More than once, Caleb had to stop and search for a mark on a tree. A bend in the creek. A ridge that looked familiar beneath ice. Every wrong turn cost them warmth. Every delay gave Silas Crow more time to find them. Eliza rode behind him with Noah wrapped against her chest. The baby slept in short, uneasy stretches. When he cried, the sound was thin but fierce. Caleb had never loved a sound more. Near dusk, the land dropped suddenly into a narrow ravine. Red stone walls stood on either side, half covered in snow. A frozen creek cut through the bottom like a pale scar. On the far side, A cabin leaned beneath a stand of black pines. Smoke rose from its chimney. Cinder ravine. Caleb said. Eliza looked at the cabin. Let me speak first. Why? Because grieving mothers hear strangers different than grieving fathers. Before Caleb could answer, the cabin door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch with a lantern in one hand. She was older than Eliza. Broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and still as stone. Her eyes moved from Caleb to Eliza. Then to the bundle against Eliza's chest. No travelers. She called. Ride on. Eliza lifted one hand. Ruth called her. The woman's face changed. Not much. Enough. Who asks? My name is Eliza Thorn. Lydia Varron saw me. The lantern dipped. For a long moment. The only sound was the wind moving through the ravine. Then Ruth said. Lydia Varron is dead. Yes. Eliza answered. But she left your name behind. Ruth did not invite them in. She only stared until Noah began to cry. That sound broke something colder than the storm. Ruth stepped aside. Bring the child. Inside. The cabin was small, clean, and spare. A fire burned low in the hearth. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. On a shelf above the table sat a small wooden horse. Carved smooth by careful hands. Caleb saw Ruth notice him looking at it. My boy made that, she said. No one spoke. Eliza sat near the fire and checked Noah, loosening the wool around his face. Ruth watched every movement with sharp suspicion. He was sick, she asked. He was made sick, Eliza said. Ruth's eyes lifted. Caleb placed Lydia's folder on the table. My wife believed your son's death was connected to other children. Ruth did not touch the folder. My son died of fever. That is what they told you, Eliza said. Ruth's hand closed around the back of a chair. You do not come into my house and speak of Micah like you know him. No, Eliza said gently. But Lydia tried to. She opened the folder and took out a letter. Ruth stared at the page. Her own name was there. Her husband's name. Her son's name. Micah called her. 10 months old. Fever recorded. Property transfer followed. Silas Crow present as temporary ranch manager. Ruth sat down as if her legs had forgotten her. Caleb said, I am sorry. Ruth did not look at him. Sorry is what people gave me when they wanted me quiet. Eliza nodded. Then we will not give you sorry. We will give you proof. Ruth read every page Lydia had kept about her family. Her face did not break. Not once. But when she reached the last line, she placed 2 fingers on Micah's name and held them there. So he was not just unlucky. She whispered. No. Eliza said. Ruth closed her eyes. And I was not foolish for thinking something was wrong. No. The room went very still. A knock came at the door. Caleb turned fast. But Ruth raised a hand. That will be Edwin Shaw, she said. Claims writer. Passes through twice a month. If Lydia told you to come here. She meant for him to hear this too. She opened the door. A thin man with snow on his shoulders stepped inside, carrying a leather case and a tired face. His eyes went to the papers on the table. Ruth stood straighter. Mr. Shaw, she said. Voice hard as iron. I have a statement to make. Eliza looked at Caleb across the fire. For the first time since Frostbend. They were not running from a lie. They were building the truth. By morning, Cinder Ravine had become a room made of ice. Snow filled the narrow pass. Wind pushed hard against Ruth Calder's cabin, making the walls groan. Inside, Edwin Shaw sat at the table with Lydia's folder open before him. Writing every word, Ruth spoke. Her voice did not shake. My son's name was Micah Calder, she said. He was 10 months old. Silas Crow came to us as a helper. He left with our land tied in his papers. Edwin's pen moved steadily. Caleb stood by the window. Noah asleep in his arms. Eliza watched the ravine through a crack in the curtain. Then she stiffened. Riders. Caleb moved beside her. Shapes appeared through the blowing snow. 5 men. Then 7. At the center rode Silas Crow. straight-backed and calm, as if he were arriving for supper instead of judgment. Ruth reached for the old iron poker beside the hearth. Eliza put a hand on her arm. Not that way. Ruth's eyes burned. He killed my boy. Then do not give him the story he wants. Outside. Silas stopped before the cabin. Caleb, he called. Bring out the child. This has gone far enough. Noah stirred at the sound. Caleb held him closer. Silas continued. Voice patient. Almost sad. No one wants blood here. You are tired. You are grieving. That woman has filled your head with ghosts. Eliza opened the door before Caleb could stop her. Cold swept into the cabin. She stepped onto the porch with Lydia's folder in her hand. Silas looked at her and smiled faintly. Miss Thorn. Still running from old charges. I hear. Eliza did not answer. Caleb came behind her. Noah bundled against his chest. Edwin Shaw stood in the doorway with his notebook. Ruth stood beside him. Silas's eyes moved over them. For the first time, his calm face tightened. You have no legal standing here. Silas said. Edwin lifted his pen. I have enough to listen. Silas's gaze returned to Caleb. Give me the folder. Come home. I will tell the sheriff this was confusion brought on by sorrow. Noah will be safe. Your ranch will be safe. Caleb felt Noah's small breath against his coat. Safe. That word had trapped him before. Silas lowered his voice. Think carefully. Keep chasing this. And the boy spends his first year dragged through courts and storms. Hand over the papers. And he sleeps in his own nursery tonight. Caleb looked at Eliza. Then at Ruth. Then at the folder Lydia had died to send home. And here. Ask yourself. If you were Caleb, would you trade the truth to protect your child for one more night? Or risk everything so no other child's name stayed buried? Caleb stepped forward. My wife trusted the truth more than comfort. He said. I am late. But I am here now. Eliza opened the folder. She began to read. Micah Calder. 10 months old. Cinder, Ravine. Ruth lifted her chin. Jonas Bell. 8 months old. Willow Creek. One of Silas's men looked toward him. Anne-Marie Tully. 6 months old. South Pass. Silas's jaw hardened. Peter, Wex. 11 months old. Millstone. Enough. Silas snapped. Eliza kept reading. Each name struck the snow like a bell. The men behind Silas shifted. One lowered his eyes. Another stepped back from his horse. As if distance could wash guilt from him. Silas pointed at Caleb. You fool. You think grief makes you noble. Those families were weak. Their land would have failed anyway. I kept order where they left ruin. Edwin's pen stopped. Then started again. Silas realized too late. Eliza closed the folder. Say more. His face went pale with rage. Noah woke and cried. Small, but clear. That sound broke the last piece of Silas's command. 2 of his men stepped away from him. Ruth walked down from the porch and stood in the snow with Micah's name written on the paper in her hand. You helped bury my son, she said. But you do not get to bury his name. Silas looked around and saw no loyal faces left. Only witnesses. Caleb held Noah close, while Edwin Shaw wrote the final line. Silas Crow had not been beaten by force. He had been caught by the dead. The living. And one child still crying in his father's arms. Silas Crow did not beg when they took his reins. Men like him rarely understood the moment they were finished. He still sat straight in the saddle. He still looked at the others as if they were hired hands waiting for orders. Even with Edwin Shaw's statement sealed in a leather case. Even with Ruth Calder holding her son's name in her hand. Even with his own riders standing farther from him than they had an hour before. No court will listen to grief and women's stories. Silas said. Ruth stepped closer. Then they will listen to paper. She answered. And they will listen to all of us. They did. It took months. Winter loosened its grip on the mountains. Snow became mud. Mud became hard spring ground. By the time the territorial court opened the case, families had come from 3 counties. Some brought letters Lydia Varron had written. Some brought old contracts they had once been too broken to read. Some brought dates, copied from family Bibles. Some brought nothing but names. Edwin Shaw brought Lydia's folder. Ruth Calder brought her statement. Caleb brought Noah. Not as evidence to be displayed, but as a child who had lived. Eliza Thorn sat near the back of the courtroom in a plain dark dress. She kept her hands folded in her lap. When men whispered about old charges and a midwife who had run from judgment years ago, she did not turn around. She had spent too long running from rooms like this. Then Mrs. Hattie Bell stood. Her voice shook at first, but it did not break. She told the court what she had seen in the nursery. She told them how Noah had grown quieter under Rusk's care. She told them how fear had made her obey orders that felt wrong. Then she looked toward Eliza. And when Mrs. Thorn entered that room, Hattie said, she saw in one breath what the rest of us had been too afraid to name. She did not harm that baby. She gave him back his cry. The courtroom changed after that. One mother stood. Then another. Then Ruth. They spoke the names Lydia had written down. Micah Calder. Jonas Bell. Anne-Marie Tully. Peter Wex. Each name landed harder than any accusation. The dead were no longer hidden beneath soft words like fever, weakness, or bad luck. Silas Crow listened with his jaw locked tight. For the first time Caleb had ever seen, Silas had no frightened household to manage. No grieving father to guide by the shoulder. No polished explanation that could make harm sound like responsibility. Only witnesses. Only ink. Only truth. Before the court closed, Edwin Shaw asked one final question. For the record, he said, who first restored the child's breathing and exposed the danger inside Frostbend Ranch? The room went still. Caleb stood with Noah in his arms. Eliza Thorn, he said. His voice carried to every bench. Eliza Thorn saved my son. Lydia Varron found the truth. Ruth Calder gave it a voice. And I was late to believe them. No one whispered after that. When Silas was taken away, he turned once toward Caleb. You would have lost everything without me, he said. Caleb held Noah closer. No, he answered. I almost lost everything because of you. No sentence brought the children back. No verdict filled an empty cradle. But the lie was broken. And sometimes that was the first mercy justice could offer. When Caleb returned to Frostbend Ranch, he did not go first to the barn, or the ledgers, or the north pasture. He went upstairs. Lydia's writing room still had the broken door. He repaired it himself. Not perfectly. One scar remained where his shoulder had split the frame. Caleb left it there. Some damage deserved to be remembered. Inside, he placed Lydia's letters in a new box, lined with blue cloth. Her ring lay on top, tied to a ribbon. Then he sat at her desk and wrote the first honest letter he had ever written to his son. Noah, your mother was afraid. Your mother rode anyway. Your mother saved you before you knew her name. I was late to believe her. One day, I will tell you that truth too. A man can love someone and still fail to hear her. But if he is given mercy, he must spend the rest of his life listening better. Caleb stopped because his hand was shaking. Behind him, Eliza stood in the doorway. You fixed the room, she said. Caleb looked at the mark, still visible in the wood. I fixed the door, he said. I am leaving the room open. Eliza nodded. She stayed through spring because Noah still needed care. She stayed through summer because Frostbend needed rebuilding. By autumn, people stopped asking when she would leave. And Caleb stopped fearing the answer. They did not speak of love quickly. Love had been used too carelessly by too many people. So, they used smaller words. Coffee. Rest. I will take him. You do not have to stand alone. On Noah's first birthday, the house filled with quiet voices. Ruth Calder came with a carved wooden horse. Hattie Bell baked a cake that leaned to one side. Jonas Reed hung a small wind chime outside the nursery window. Caleb carried Noah to the glass. The child reached for the blue ribbon where Lydia's ring hung in the light. His small fingers touched the gold. And for a moment, the room went very still. Outside, the wind moved through the chime. One clear note rang out. No one called it a sign. No one needed to. Caleb looked at Eliza. She stood beside him. Not in Lydia's place. Not in anyone's shadow. But, as herself. Noah laughed. And Frostbend Ranch, which had once been sealed with heat, silence, and lies, stood open to the clean mountain air. A child breathing. A room left open. A mother remembered. A woman believed. And the names of the dead finally spoken in the light. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events, is purely coincidental.